Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome from SEDAC, the Smart Energy Design Assistance Center located in beautiful Champaign-Urbana. Today's webinar is on the top 10 requirements you should know, 2018 IECC Residential Provisions. I am Robert Nemeth, and my colleague, Ryan Siegal, will be giving today's presentation. It will last about an hour, but the latter part of this will include a period for you to ask questions and for us to respond. There is a question on your screen. There should be a box that you can activate questions where you can type in your question. They will appear on our screens, and we will respond either at that point or later in the presentation towards the end. Today's presentation is being recorded, so you can come back and take a look at it. It is also, there will be a PDF available on our website, and you are getting credit for listening in today. There are AEE credits and the IECC credits available for this, which you will get after the presentation. So we have some learning objectives today. The changes in the updates in the Illinois Energy Conservation Code from 2015 to 2018, which are not major. There's some small ones, but we'll point those out. We're going to identify 10 most important Illinois Energy Conservation Code compliance issues in residential construction and understand how to comply with the current Illinois Energy Conservation Code for residential construction. So this is who we are. We are, as I mentioned, located in Champaign-Urbana at the University of Illinois, and our mission is to reduce the energy footprint of Illinois and beyond. We have quite a few, we're blessed at being part of the university, and we have a lot of graduate students that come through here, and we train them, and they head out into the world and do good things. So what we do, we help facilities become more energy efficient. We have done well over 1,000 audits of buildings in the state of Illinois. We educate all kinds of people, code officials, professionals, contractors, students, and a lot of times that education is reciprocal. We try to learn from others too. So we do basic research, applied research, not basic research, but applied research, and we advocate for a greener future. So today's presentation is brought to you by, well, we're bringing it to you, but it's sponsored by the Illinois IEPA. They are great partners to work with. As far as SEDAC, you can get technical support for code questions at the phone number there, the 1-800 number, or email us. We prefer the email really, because then we have a documentation of your question and we can respond via email too. But either way, you can contact us. We have online resources on our website, as you see there, the SEDAC.org. We conduct workshops, we conduct webinars, and we also have some online demand training modules. Those you can do at your leisure. The International Energy Conservation Code, IECC, you can see the link at the top. You can get that online, you can search it. It's a very handy feature, but you cannot print out anything or capture anything and cut and paste. But it is all online. All the international codes, IECC codes are online. The building codes, fire codes, mechanical codes are all online. So it's a great service provided by the ICC. And then that is So the state of Illinois adopts that, the Illinois Energy Conservation Code, and then makes its own amendments to it. And on the right of the screen, you can see a little snippet of those amendments and a link to those amendments on the CBD website. So the SEDAC Top 10 Series webinars. Today's webinar is on residential. You can see that the next one is on commercial envelopes, and then commercial lighting, commercial HVAC, and then we're going to tie things up with a ComCheck and ResCheck walkthrough on May 6th of 2020. And below is where you can sign up for these webinars. The SEDAC Top 40 workshops. We have October 2nd in downtown Chicago. Then we have Belleville, Aurora. You can see those first three with asterisks. We are doing those with CBD, and the morning session is on accessibility code training, and the afternoon session will be SEDAC with the energy code information. So we're doing that with CBD. So we look, how do we come up with our top 10 list? Well, we look at various studies, federal studies done by the DOE or their contractors, such as PNNL, Pacific Northwest Labs. And one of the studies that we found from 2013 show, and granted, this is only for about 6 states, but it found that non-compliance areas, you can see on the graph there, that envelope sealing was the #1 non-compliance area, and the duct sealing was the second. I hypothesize that that is because those are the newest additions to the code, and a lot of those require third-party assessment. So they're kind of new, let's say within the last 6 years or so as a requirement, and they're just kind of difficult to comply with. It's sort of new to the code. Then you can see that lighting fixtures and envelope installation are also up there. This has probably changed somewhat over the years, but those are probably still the largest areas of non-compliance: envelope sealing and duct sealing. And we're going to be talking about those later this morning, or this afternoon, I should say. So another study that we looked at was a PNNL study, and they showed the individual code requirements with the largest energy impacts. Once again, envelope air sealing was right up there. Windows and solar heat gain factors and their U factors, that was up there. Although we suspect that most of that's been resolved. The windows have gotten better and better, and it's an assembly. So you're buying an assembly rather than on an envelope where you're putting a lot of pieces together. So you can see it: wall insulation, ceiling insulation, lighting, and foundation and duct, and we're going to talk about all those this afternoon. So we also look at more regional studies, in the Midwest Energy Alliance compliance study found that this is an ongoing study. It's current right now, but their preliminary results for 63 homes was blower door rates are compliant with 2015 and 2018 IECC, but are all buildings being tested? So that's a sort of a question they're posing. Lighting compliance is good. Ceiling and frame wall cavity insulation, there's a high non-compliance, which we find kind of surprising. Quality and installation of insulation can improve. That's not surprising. Performance paths utilized more than anticipated. Some jurisdiction not enforcing the current state code at all, such as like where I live out in the country, where you can pretty much do anything. There's no one looking at what you're doing out there. Window U factors and glazing fenestration is compliant. Duct systems are leaky, and heated basements are not insulated properly. So that was more a regional study for just Illinois. So these are and then we also talk a lot with code officials, professionals, and others, and amongst ourselves and some of the research that we read. And these are the top 10 requirements. They're not necessarily in order of importance, but they're more in the order that we're going to go through the code book. So the energy certificate, insulation, envelopes, so you can see these are the topics that we're going to talk about that Ryan and I are going to talk about this morning.
So as we get to the energy certificate, this is something that's somewhat newer, but is very good information because frequently people will not necessarily have access to the original construction drawings. And so the code requires that there be a certificate posted. Typically these are either in the furnace room or near the electrical panel, or perhaps even on the cover of the electrical panel, not obscuring the label, of course. But noting, it lists several qualities that must be included in this or on these labels, and some of the reasons that we find this to be very important, particularly when you get into like U factors for the fenestration, is yes, the windows come with the label on them, but during construction, then that label gets removed or shortly thereafter. And so if I end up with a broken window, I need to make sure that I know how good the window was, so I don't end up degrading my energy performance. Particularly as we get later on about equipment sizing. If you end up putting in windows that are worse than the original construction, you could end up with a deficiency and a comfort problem, not only from the lack of insulation in the window, but your heating and air conditioning system may not be able to keep up either. So here's one example that the ICC has available from their website. There's many other particular labels out there. Some builders make their own, and so that's perfectly acceptable as long as it has all the required information. Now, something that I did note on here that I might definitely call into question if I was a code official is all of these are the default or minimum values for code, particularly here, the blower door testing at 3 ACH exactly. That would be highly unusual to have a blower door come in exactly right on the money, and not be a little tighter than normal. So that might be something that I'd probably look a little closer and say, does the blower door listed on the energy certificate match the documentation that was provided for the blower door testing? As we get into insulation, and this is for the prescriptive path, so there are some other paths that can be done. Prescriptive is kind of the most general, just checklist, go through, make sure you've complied with all the individual components, and if you do that, then everything, you have a compliant construction. So here we're noting that there is an Illinois amendment to this table, R40212, where they have loosened the restriction just ever so slightly for the northern portion of the state, so that the entire state has the same criteria for basement wall R values. And also new for the 2018, or perhaps a little bit of a modification of wording, is that R5 insulation under the full slab area. Previously it was just an additional R5 to the exterior perimeter of the slab. Now it requires it under the entire slab for heated slabs. So one table that we frequently like to help point people to is this table for air barrier and insulation installation. As Robert noted, these are frequently some difficult areas to comply with, particularly because the details matter in this. If you end up with a little hole in your air barrier, that small hole can let a substantial amount of energy and air through. But so this table R402411 is very important, and if there's typically a problem with a building in the residential building, it will probably be covered on this table as far as challenges and issues. As Robert noted, installation quality is very important for insulation for performance. And so here you can see in the upper right corner an error of installation where reducing the quality of the insulation value by compressing that insulation around that electrical wire. And similarly, you can see that again in the photograph there. Rather than splitting the bat in half and putting half the bat behind the wire and half in front. So here we're calling out also the HERS rating, where this generally ties into the ERI, or one of the performance paths is using a HERS rater. And so one of the grades that they give is installation quality. And there's 3 different grades. So obviously one is the best, where all the insulation was installed per the manufacturer's directions, fills all the cavity, it's not compressed, it's cut and split around pipes and wires as appropriate. And so generally it's not compressed. So grade 1, this is you're getting an A for your installation on this one. Grade 2 is perhaps a B or a C, where there's some defects, but it's reasonably well done. There can be some moderate installation defects, and then grade 3 is obviously the worst, with substantial gaps and voids. And below is kind of an example as far as trying to help determine some of that grade. So grade 1 is you got 100% compliance. Grade 2 is maybe 98%. It's really pretty good job, but there's definitely some holes. And a grade 3, 5% or more is uninsulated, treated. So. And here you can kind of see some parameters and what that might look like in the field, whether that's missing insulation, compressed insulation, and some of this may depend on who the insulation manufacturer is. One insulation manufacturer for the craft face insulation you see on the left there, they say that you are to lap that onto the face of the studs and attach it there, and so that is minimizing any compression that may be available. There was another manufacturer out there that does say it's acceptable to staple it just to the inside edge of the stud, but that is not a best practice. So again, if you're compressing that insulation, you don't end up with as many air pockets, and really air is what's doing the insulation for these products. So again, noting here a lot more critical details. Did you cut it around the box and it's very neat, or did you just stuff it in around the box and just tuck it in? Are there gaps around when you insulated the floor? Did you actually get the insulation all the way up against the floor above for maximum contact? So Again, throughout this process, you're seeing we're trying not to leave any gaps where things are not insulated. And we want to make sure that it's maintaining contact all the way through. As far as basement walls, here again, there's some Illinois specific amendments on this for basement walls. You know, we want to make sure that we're insulating down, and here noting with the exception, the original provision is 10 feet below grade. There is an exception to allow you to only have to insulate down 4 foot below grade if you add additional insulation. One thing that this can cause some issues is if you do end up stopping your insulation early, particularly if you have metal studs, this can cause some major conduction issues and potential mold in the future. So code compliance is supposed to be a minimum standard. Does not mean that you will end up with a good building or a healthy building. It's just the bare minimum that you have to do as a, you know, it's kind of like getting a D. You did enough to not fail, but this is definitely not good work. So basement walls, looking at basement walls, where are you above grade or below grade? Basement wall is noting for the IECC is 50% or more below grade and enclosing conditioned space. So as you can see from that illustration, that basement, we've got 3 below grade walls, or 3 basement walls and 1 exterior wall. Also noting here when we have a slash, as far as continuous insulation, or you can add more if you're doing cavity insulation. Again, we don't see this too often in residential, but we'll be concerned if using metal studs, because metal studs eliminate about 2/3 of insulation's performance. So an R30 insulation product in the cavity of a metal stud will only perform about like an R10. So with that, we'll turn it over to Robert to talk a little bit more about air leakage and getting our envelope sealing right.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. The screen's off a little bit. Okay, is air sealing a big deal? Yes, it is. The primary energy consumption attributed to building envelope components in 2010, now this is across the country, and this is in quads, which is a number with a lot of zeros on the end. You can see that it's 2.26 heating on the heating side and 0.59 on the cooling. Of all the numbers, that is the largest component on the heating side, the 2.26, meaning that infiltration is a very big deal. We're losing a lot of energy by cold air leaking into our buildings, and as that cold air leaks in, usually down towards the base of our buildings, the warm air inside, it gets warmed, it rises up to the top of the building and finds its way out at where it exfiltrates our building. So reducing infiltration has received a lot of attention in the last decade or so, and it's for good reason. And along with that exfiltration, a lot of times we can cause problems with moisture problems, and we'll talk a little bit about that following up here. So the first thing we need to do is identify where the thermal envelope is. And I found this example in a South Face, they're out of Georgia, presentation. I thought this is very well done. You can see the 3 different examples where we're outlining the building thermal envelope. Where is that envelope? And this is important for not only the building official, but the contractor, you know, where are we insulating this building? Where are the details that we are going to have to pay particular attention to? For example, in 2, we have a cathedral ceiling with an attic space where the knee walls are insulated and the ceiling below or the floor of that attic is then a part of our thermal boundary. Or in example 3, where we've just enclosed everything, where we've just we've got the cathedral ceiling insulated all the way to the top. So, and likewise down at the base, is our crawl space a part of a conditioned space or not part of a conditioned space? So it's a big deal to try to identify where your building thermal envelope is. Here we see a graphic of where our typical leakage points are. And you can see they're all over. We have cold air usually leaking in down low in our buildings, and then, as I mentioned, rising up and leaking out through attic hatches or upper story windows or joints between the walls to the ceilings. Those are notoriously leaky places in commercial buildings. Might be soffits or recessed can lights or other utility penetrations if we have any type of utilities up in the attic, which is not uncommon. So a lot of different areas to pay attention to. So in the code, our 402.4 air leakage, it's a mandatory and it's a 2-step process. We have the installation where we have to pay attention to the materials we are using and how those various materials are attached to one another so that they will be resilient and robust and not separate over time. And then the testing. And the testing is done with a blower door. The International Energy Conservation Code states 5 air changes per hour in Illinois in our zones. Illinois has amended that to be 4 air changes per hour, so it's a little more stringent than the International Energy Conservation Code. And we also have to provide a written report to the building code official. Ryan already showed you this table, but he had the right side of that table highlighted, or I should say bounded. This table is actually much larger. This is just a portion of that table. And the right side was the installation criteria, and here we have the air barrier criteria. This is a pretty handy table to pay attention to when you're designing the air barrier for your building. And here is a very handy guide, particularly for contractors. If you're having problem with compliance, meeting air changes per hour or the tightness of your building, there's a lot of good examples in this document. We have the link below the guide, and it's just a good thing for a good publication for a lot of good information. So, you know, a tight house will have a lower heating bills, which, you know, as energy becomes more expensive, that's a big deal. It'll be more comfortable, have fewer drafts. When we have air leaks, there's a potential for our warmer, humid air to leak when it's exfiltrating and then condensing inside cavities in the building and causing problems. We've seen that before. And the problem with those kinds of issues are that they take time to develop into real problems. And it's not until it becomes a really big problem that you might notice that. So reducing exfiltration during the winter is a very good thing. You'll have a better performing ventilation system, and it might actually require, the tighter your house is, the smaller heating and cooling equipment you might need. So sealing air leaks. Well, there's a lot of different ways to do it. Weather stripping, door sweeps, silicone caulks, spray foam. I've used, I can't tell you how many cans of spray foam I've used. I do some contracting myself and to sealing leaks. And then the seal between the foundation and the seal and sill plate is a notoriously leaky space too, or joint, I should say, where dissimilar materials meet, and that is a good place to use caulk. And then foam gaskets between outlets and switch plates. Hopefully you don't need those, but they are very effective in older construction, such as, or existing construction, such as my 100-year-old house, for reducing air leakage. So here's some examples of air sealing. We see a gentleman there caulking between plates. We can see up in the attic a lot of foam being used where the drywall meets the walls. Wire penetrations and utility penetrations, such as for vents, plumbing vents, and things of that nature. Rope on the top right, rope caulk or back rod is a very effective means to stop air. And then I usually put some caulk over the top of that, to a thin bead of caulk over that if it's not a really wide gap. Caulking trim is very effective. We also have some pictures of a proprietary type of air sealing method. It's not that we're proponents of this, but it's a very interesting method where before the house is before it's occupied, before you have a lot of stuff inside there, it's called aero barrier, where you pressurize the house with a blower door, and these misters are spaced around the house, and that particulate matter that is blown into the air finds every small leak where that air is leaking out of your building, and does a very effective job at sealing. Some of the numbers they show on some of the research is pretty astounding at how effective this method of air sealing is. And you can see on the bottom right side where these particles have you can see them around the perimeter of the box there, and inside the box where the wires penetrate to the outside of the box and into the cavity where all these little particulates have collected, thank you, Ryan, and sealed the leaks. It's not that we're saying everybody should be doing this, but it's just something for your own knowledge, and it's called aero barrier. I think DOE funded some of this research too, and it's quite interesting. I've done a lot of blower door testing with some colleagues in the past, and these are just some of the common air leak locations beneath vanities and kitchen sinks. A lot of times the penetrations into the wall are not sealed. Air can leak through those and into the wall cavity, and you may think, well, it's not a big deal if it's into the interior wall, such as a vanity that might not be on an exterior wall. Well, it still is, because that plumbing then rises up and goes through the top plates into the attic, and if that's not sealed, which in a lot of cases it isn't, that air, warm air from inside will rise up through that cavity and then into the attic, and you'll have a nice convective current there. You can see in the top middle, utility penetrations where the refrigerant lines and looks like some other wires, thermostat wire going up again in the attic. Just an open hole up into the attic. Top right, the can lights are notoriously leaky in older construction. Bottom left, that's a range hood. I've got dozens of pictures of large air leaks there up into the attic. I've got dozens of pictures, such as the one in the middle, bottom middle there, where utility penetrations are not sealed so that air can get right into that wall assembly. And then very common are weather stripping issues on doors. And it all adds up to quite a bit of area. These are some other leakage locations. We have an attic hatch here. I was up north in a house, and it's interesting where this hatch actually they went to extremes. They had sash locks to try to pull that attic access door down tight to the trim, and it was actually there was a foam gasket. But you can see when I opened up that attic hatch, there was mold forming on that insulation dam on the side there. And that just a clear indication of air leakage that was leaking up into the attic and condensing on that drywall. Drywall loves to grow mold. And as you can see, that's an issue there, which was, I would not have expected that at all. Another one in the middle there is a strike plate on an interior wall, and we were blower door testing a house, and I walked into the bathroom there, and it was just like, where is that airstream coming from? And it took me a while to figure out, oh, it's coming from that strike plate. And I still to this day don't know if it came from the attic or the crawl space, but our recommendation there was just to put a dab of foam, spray foam inside that and stop that air movement. It's very odd. You know, I've helped frame houses, so I don't know how that penetration went all the way through the door jamb into the space behind the jamb, but still, I don't know where that air was coming from. And then we find stuff like on the right where there's a clean out back there, and my colleague is holding a piece of toilet paper, and we are just drawing air like crazy from probably both the crawl space and the attic space there. So things to look for. And then improper air sealing. You can see that the outlet to the outside there has not been sealed on the far left. The second slide there, that should have been an improper insulation installation where it's all compressed like what Ryan was talking about. The third slide is the bath fan that has not been sealed to the drywall there. And the fourth one is the foundation wall to the sill plate has not been sealed there too. So, air leakage.
As far as we move over to the blower door testing, so once we've sealed our house, we need to go through and test it, because that's, you know, that's kind of the important part, is making sure that we verify that what we did was installed correctly. So this is mandatory for residential construction. We'll ask a question here shortly about this. But noting here in residential, not exceeding 4 changes per hour here in the state of Illinois, and that took effect, so Illinois took effect with the 2018 July 1st of this year. So the code officials also may require that this be conducted by a third party, or it may be conducted by the builder if the code official deems that acceptable. So obviously, if we're going to test our air barrier for the outside wall, then we need to make sure that all the penetrations have been already made in that, because we don't want to add holes to the through the air barrier after we've already tested to prove that it's in compliance. So here's several steps as far as doing the testing. You know, really you want this to be in a manner that it's not in a manner such that it's likely to be during living conditions. You know, so your fireplace, your dampers you're going to close them, but you're not going to, you know, tape them and seal them shut during normal occupancy. So we want to make sure interior doors are opened, so that way air can flow where it needs to during the testing. But yeah, so really we want to make sure that the building is in a livable state. Something else that Illinois added as an amendment is for low-rise multifamily is, rather than doing it as a volumetric measurement of air changes per hour, so many times the volume of the building, this is looking at doing it based on the envelope enclosure area. And so this is some 0.25 cubic feet per minute of enclosure area. So this is the outside surface, which really is more of a measurement of the performance of that envelope. That's one, this was added particularly because as you get smaller units, the ratio of surface area to volume tends to skew rather poorly. So this is really more accurate as far as what the objective is. We are testing how airtight is our barrier. And noting here, if you do have more than 7 units in a building, then you can use a sampling methodology that is also spelled out in the code. As far as duct insulation and sealing, insulation, this is again a prescriptive requirement here, noting if they are leaving conditioned space, we need to make sure that we are insulating our ducts. Because, to be honest, and frequently we see air handlers up in attics or down in crawl spaces. It's kind of hard to make ice cream while you're sitting in your attic. So that's where we want to make sure that we're insulating this, not only from an energy standpoint, but also from a moisture and mold potential standpoint. If you don't have your ducts insulated, and this is where the detailing of installation performance really matters, is if you end up with you insulated most of the duct, but then you didn't seal some of the seams, you could end up with moisture issues, which can lead to mold. So duct sealing, again, this is mandatory regardless of your performance path, and noting that you are to seal all the joints and seams. And with this, noting that 20 to 30% of the without duct sealing, it's not uncommon to see 20 to 30% of the air leave the ductwork through leaks and holes. And even in the return, this is important to seal because, yes, air may not leak out of the return duct, but you can actually pull dust and other contaminants into the return duct. So the leaks will happen both ways. So here's some examples. You'll notice we've got some mastics that can be painted and brushed on. Some of these are special foil tapes. None of this, you will not see anything here with duct tape, which should be used on anything but ducts. But yes, these are foil tapes designed for proper sealing, and making sure that we're sealing that. As you can see in the lower left there, there's a duct boot coming up and sealing that with mastic to that substrate, the subflooring there. So again, we want to make sure that all the air that you paid for to deliver to the space actually reaches the space. Here noting some of the criteria for duct testing as far as differentials, and depending on if the air handler is installed, then your leakage must be less than 4 cubic feet per minute per 100 square foot of area. If the air handler has not been installed, then it has to be tighter than 3 cubic feet per minute per 100 square foot of conditioned floor area. And here, the written report of the results, again, has to be provided to the code official. Now, one easy way to get away from needing duct testing is using some of these exceptions. One of these is make sure that you put your ductwork and your air handler inside the entirely within the thermal envelope, and particularly you want it inside the air barrier. So if you do leak, it's inside the house, and you don't end up leaking outside. So putting the air handler and the ductwork inside the house, then you don't end up having to test. So Here's some pictures as far as what duct testing actually looks like. Placing the duct blaster or ductwork into the typically a return grill, and then going through and doing the testing. One thing that we will call out, in the lower end, you'll see they're inserting a pressure probe into the ductwork, is making sure at the conclusion of the test that is sealed with foil tape again, because we've now made a hole. We need to make sure we seal it after we're done. So so here, again, we're trying to seal off all the vents and test for leakage in the ductwork. So by pressurizing that air handler on the left side there, it's putting positive pressure on all the ductwork in any holes it'll leak out of that we can then measure. So common practices in the past are now no longer acceptable. And here's an interesting image that we had came across, which was that return cavity in the picture all the way on the far left looks, in this case, the air handler is in the space below, but that return is not fully sealed, and so it's actually pulling the hot attic air into that wall cavity. So that's that thermal image that you're seeing there, is that hot attic air being pulled, being sucked into that cavity by that return. So with beginning with pipe insulation, we'll turn it back over to Robert here.
Thank you, Ryan. We're running a kind of behind schedule here. So I'm going to be quick. Mechanical system piping insulation. It's mandatory. You can see one pipe is very well insulated there. These are your refrigerant lines to an AC unit. The other one is uninsulated. That probably would not pass code. Likewise, hot water pipes, those need insulation too. R3, not less than R3, should be applied to the following. As you can see the list right there. Always a good practice to insulate your piping. Let's talk about HVAC equipment load and sizing. I just put this in here. I found this in a presentation and I got a really kick out of this. Ryan has actually seen somebody do this, where you cut out the holes and stand back and see how big it is and size your system. I thought it was just a joke. That's why I put it in here. And Ryan says, no, I actually saw somebody do this. So hard to believe, but I thought it was pretty funny. Equipment sizing and efficiency ratings, mandatory. You have to use, well, you don't have to use manual J. If your local authority says you can use some other method to calculate loads, you can, but manual J is recommended. You cannot just say, oh, X amount of square feet per ton, and use those typical methods that we used to use in the past. And then, so you can see there's a J for the residential load calculations and the S equipment selection. Those two are recommended. We also recommend putting in the duct. There's a manual D, duct size calculations, and properly sizing your ducts too. It's just one more step that give you a better building. Why this emphasis on sizing equipment? Well, what's changed over the years? Well, our thermal envelopes have improved substantially. We've made them a lot tighter, and we've also put a lot more insulation in there. So our typical rules of thumb do not apply anymore. So the air tightness is now very important, as we've been talking about. Natural ventilation has been greatly reduced because our envelopes don't leak. We have lower loads on the inside, and moisture. The bottom one is very important. More moisture is retained. That's why, and Ryan will be talking about this in a moment, about ventilation. We need to get rid, we've trapped that moisture that we're creating on the inside of the building in our tight buildings, and we need to get rid of that moisture or we can have some severe problems on the inside. The manual J has all the conditions that we need in our design process for outdoor design conditions, and very important to use the proper numbers. Otherwise, you may very well oversize your equipment. They have checklists for Manual S for selecting your equipment, and then worksheets also for deciding what size equipment you need, and so on and so forth. These are right out of Manual S, some of their examples in the book.
So as we move over to mechanical ventilation, again, as Robert said, now we've sealed up and made our houses tight. I frequently hear a phrase, build it tight, ventilate right. So now that we've built our homes tight, to make sure to control, we can actually control what we are bringing into the house and pulling out of the house. So mechanical ventilation is required to be provided, and there are 3 different methods to do that. These are negative, positive, and balanced. So you can use exhaust only, which seems to be the more common type. You can use supply only, which is less common, but we do see that. And the third is balanced supply and exhaust. These are typically done using a heat recovery unit because the air streams, because when you've balanced it, you can exchange that much easier, and that you can exchange that energy. So when you've thrown that air outside, you don't have to throw the heat out with it or the cooling out with it in the summer. So there's several tables here that Illinois has brought into, and these are out of either the mechanical code or the residential code, because not all jurisdictions have adopted it, so Illinois has brought these in. Now, what it does allow for is it can either be continuous operation, or you can cycle it for at least, it must run at least 25% of every 4 hours in order to meet your ventilation requirements. So here you can see a depiction of the 3 different kinds. The first one is what we'll commonly see is a local exhaust fan in the common area, just pulling air out and then hoping that or relying on the envelope to leak enough air back in. Second is tied into the return, so that air can at least be conditioned that we've brought in from the outside, and then having the air leak out, typically through our exhaust fans. And then the third is a balanced, where you can either do it with a single fan or 2 fans. You can just combine the first 2 and have it where it's in the return fan, using the air handler fan and a local exhaust fan. So you can do it with 2 fans if you prefer. So this first one, here you can see a multi-speed model here, where it even also tells you how long it needs to run. In this case, so run this many CFM and this many minutes out of every, maybe out of every hour, say, run every 15 minutes out of every hour. And so the fan will cycle on and off for you. Again, that's relying on negative ventilation, is relying on your envelope to just leak cold or hot unconditioned air and likely moisture through your envelope. Positive, this is relying on the air to leak out of your envelope. And then balanced, again, we're trying to provide pull it in from outside, and we've provided dedicated holes through that air barrier to do that. So I noted Illinois has made several amendments to bring several of the IRC code tables and requirements into the Illinois Energy Conservation Code, because not all jurisdictions have adopted the Illinois or the International Residential Code or other residential code equivalents. So they brought this in, and so we did go ahead and provide a link again here. These links are also provided on our website, SEDAC.org. If you run into any challenges and you're like, oh, what's that link again to the amendments or the international codes, you can come to our website, SEDAC.org, and on the upper right-hand corner, it'll be energy code is what you're looking at. So with lighting, we'll turn it over to Robert.
Thank you, Ron. Illinois amendments have made some changes to the code, or I should say the 2018 IECC. They upped it from 75% to 90% of the fixtures, of the permanently installed fixtures, shall contain only high efficacy lamps. So that doesn't leave you a lot of wiggle room for stuff, but then again, so many lighting fixtures these days are already compliant that it's not that hard to meet that portion of the code. One thing that was changed was low voltage exception removed. Low voltage lighting was removed as an exception from the 2018 IECC. So if you have low voltage lighting, it will have to conform with the permanently installed fixtures that contain only high efficacy lamps. And then the other thing about recessed lighting, it has to be IC rated, in contact rated, and be rated at a leakage rate of less than no greater than 2 CFM, and then at 75 pascals. And then it also has to be gasketed or caulked around the perimeter so it doesn't leak air. And like I mentioned in our blower door tests in older houses, recessed lighting is notoriously leaky. So this is trying to address those types of issues.
So as we get over to additions, alterations, renovations, this is where a lot of the questions and challenges will definitely come into play here. We do have several questions here I do see. We'll get to those shortly as we conclude our presentation. But as we get into additions and alterations, this notes that only the alterations need to comply with the requirements for new construction, and alterations should not be less conforming than the existing building was before you started to alter it. Now, there's a couple of provisions in there that also state that what you are doing must comply without requiring things that are not being worked on to comply. So I hear there was a question about I got old walls, and I'm doing a lighting project. Do I have to bring the walls up to compliance? Well, because I'm doing a lighting project, that's where I need to make sure that the lighting complies with the requirements for the code. I don't have to worry about the wall if I'm not disturbing it. Now, in the alterations, there are several exceptions here that are not requiring you to bring things up to code. Number 2 here is one that we'll get several questions on, as far as ceiling and wall floor cavities that are exposed during construction. So if I remove plaster and lath or drywall and I've now exposed the cavities, I don't have to bring the cavity up to the full value stated in the table, R20 or I believe it's R13 plus 5 continuous, but I do have to fill the cavity with insulation. So if I got a 2x4 wall and I put a 2x4 batt insulation in that cavity, I have complied with the code. I don't have to, even if that's not a full R20 in that cavity, that's perfectly acceptable. So a roof recover, I will call out, there's a specific definition, that is installing a new membrane over the existing membrane. So that is not pulling the existing membrane. So here's some pictorial examples of that. And again, on the right here, we can see a masonry wall. This is where another place we'll frequently get this challenge as far as, okay, here in the lower picture there, you can see, I've pulled the plaster and lath off and I have just some furring strips. So here I don't have a cavity, so I don't have to worry about insulating the cavity because I don't have one to insulate. The lower left there you can see here we've exposed a cavity, and all he's doing is putting a batt insulation to fill the cavity, and that's all they will have to do for compliance with the energy code for the insulation piece. So one Illinois amendment that we will call your attention to is a roof membrane peel and replacement. This was new for the 2018, and we wanted to call out that this is a very narrow provision and is rarely likely to apply. And purely because flat roofs rarely are addressed before they leak. Once they have leaked, you have now damaged your insulation. So this would only come into play if you have a roof that's in excellent condition with no leaks, so that you pull the membrane and put a new membrane down, and that's it. So if you are having to touch the insulation or the sheathing, this membrane peel and replacement does not apply. Here's a good one where, this is where real life hits the road, and saying, okay, we've peeled up the roof. We know that the roof will need to be insulated. Question becomes the skylight. Will you have to? This could be a little bit of a challenge because it looks like they pulled the flashing out from under that skylight, so you may end up having to pull that skylight in order to properly flash that. In order to properly flash that, and once you've pulled the skylight, now you've touched it. So code compliance could be triggered if a roofer is not careful, and you may end up causing additional work beyond the scope that you originally intended. But if all they did was the roof and the skylight was perfectly intact, potentially they could have left the skylight uninsulated. So we'll leave you with here's our list of top 10. I do want to thank everyone for coming today. We'll stay a few extra minutes here to answer some of the questions that have come in, but also we're interested to know if you think that something else you think should have made the top 10 instead of this. Please type that in the Q&A is one of your questions. You should be able to find that by either floating at the top or bottom of your screen, and a bar should appear to allow you to ask questions up there. So yes, go ahead and if you think that something else should have made this top 10, go ahead and put that in as one of the questions there. As far as our questions that have come in, someone had asked about our statement about the reducing cavity, metal studs reducing effectiveness, and that information actually comes out of the code book. There's a table C402.1.4.1 that shows the effectiveness, and as you can see from that table, frequently the insulation degrades somewhere between 50 and 70% by having a metal stud. As far as the insulation, someone did point out that the 4 foot down, if you're going to use that insulating only 4 foot down rather than the 10 foot that the code calls out, you do need the higher level of insulation of the 15 or 19. So that's very important to see and observe that to make sure that you're using the right amount. So yeah, that's where you have to use a higher amount if you're going only 4 foot down versus if you're going the full 10. So Here's a question about old construction. Again, here noted, you know, if you're not doing anything that's touching the outside walls, then the outside walls don't have to be brought up to compliance. You know, now if you're doing windows, then those windows need to comply. But just by installing new windows does not require you to insulate that wall. And that's that exception of, even if you do expose the cavity, as long as you fill the cavity, that is considered compliance. That is a good exception to be used. Someone did call out, did notice that the blower door testing is only in the residential provisions. So if you are in a commercial building, then commercial buildings do not require, but they do have an option for pressure testing. And the GSA has actually done some studies and shown, and so I believe the Army Corps of Engineers requires blower door testing even on all of their commercial buildings, not just their residential buildings. And that's because they've found deficiencies there. Here was a question about the as far as the duct leakage testing and the difference between 3 cubic feet per minute and 4 cubic feet per minute. There may have been a little bit of confusion here. The question had about 3 air changes per hour and 4 air changes per hour. That's not correct for duct testing. Duct testing is so many cubic feet per minute per 100 square foot of conditioned space. And so if the air handler is installed, then it can leak no more than 4 cubic feet per minute per 100 square foot conditioned. If the air handler is not installed, then it has to be tighter. It can leak no more than 3 cubic feet per minute. So the blower door test can be performed by whomever the code official deems appropriate. An architect or engineer is likely to be acceptable to the code official. The code official is likely to just be concerned if the builder who built the building would want to do the blower door test because of a real close conflict of interest. Architect or engineer likely to be acceptable, but again, it's determined by the code official if the architect or engineer would be an independent source. So. Let's see here. Again, this will be recorded. This webinar has been recorded and will be posted to our website, so you can view it again. We will send out links afterwards to our website, so those will be good for you. So. If you do have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us, energycode@sedac.org, or the 800 number. So I realize we're about 10 minutes over, so I want to thank everyone who is still left here. But with that, we'll have a good afternoon, and we'll say goodbye here from Champaign. Thank you very much.